Universität zu Köln. And Nayeli Salgado is at Vienna University of Economics and Business, Wirtschaftsuniversität Wien. And although there are 3 authors, only Aldo will be presenting today. The dynamic of this session will be as follows. He will have 45 minutes for his presentation, and then we will open a round of questions and comments. You may use the chat to request participation, so that as soon as Aldo finishes his presentation, I will give you the microphone on a first come, first served basis. And I think that's all I need to say. So Aldo, please, you may start with the presentation, whatever you want.
No, thanks. I'm just going to have to share first my presentation.
Yes.
I think, is that okay? Everyone can see this, right? Okay. Right, okay. I think that is the presentation. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great honor to be in this webinar. And secondly, I would like to acknowledge financial support from my main funder, the British Academy. Now, this is joint work with Eduardo Hidalgo and Nayeli Salgado. And before I begin with my presentation, let me just clarify 2 key concepts of the paper. We define indigenous institutions as the political complexity of an ethnic group in pre-colonial times. And nation building is essentially the use of state power in order to consolidate a national identity. Now, let's move on to the motivation of the paper. What do we know about this? Well, we know that large-scale infrastructure projects are very beneficial for long-run development. However, indigenous people tend to reject these mega projects. In this picture, you can see a group of indigenous people in Mexico protesting against the construction of a road called Carretera de las Culturas, or the Culture of Roads, which somehow is part of another mega project known as the Tren Maya, or the Mayan Train, which is meant to connect various parts in the south of Mexico. And of course, these mega projects would be very beneficial for these communities by creating jobs, for example. However, indigenous people in these communities reject these mega projects because they believe that these large-scale infrastructure projects will not be beneficial for their own communities, but only for large transnational, for example. And what's interesting about this issue is that this is not only present in Mexico. For example, according to the United Nations, indigenous people across the world tend to reject these mega projects. What's important is that in doing so, this creates a lot of conflicts between indigenous communities and the state, as well as between indigenous people and transnational, to the point in which indigenous people have been killed after they've been protesting against the construction of these mega projects in their communities. While all this is very important, somehow we know very little in terms of empirical terms about the association between these mega projects and indigenous people. So in this paper, we put forward a very simple research question. We want to know which indigenous groups are better able to reject large-scale infrastructure projects. And of course, we want to understand what are the main mechanisms that could explain these associations. And we also assess the main economic consequences of this rejection. So to investigate this, we exploit this unique experimental setting from the aftermath of the Mexican Revolution between 1920s and 1950s, when the first large-scale road program in Mexico emerged and was used as a tool for nation building. Now, let me just give you a quick summary of the main findings of the paper, which can be seen in this figure. This figure shows the evolution of road infrastructure in Mexico in 2 groups of municipalities: fragmented municipalities, which are denoted by the dashed line, and centralized municipalities, which are represented by the solid line. Now, if you focus on the main period of a study from 1920s to 1950s, it is clear that road infrastructure was significantly larger in fragmented municipalities than central municipalities, suggesting that centralized indigenous groups were better able to reject this large-scale road program in Mexico. Now, to formalize this association, we then exploit the evolution of road infrastructure in a different deep setting. And we propose two main mechanisms that could explain this association. First, better collective actions and a higher preference to preserve the ethnic identity and local practices among the centralized indigenous groups. Now, we're hoping to contribute in three ways. First, there is a growing literature analyzing the association between pre-colonial institutions and economic development. And this literature essentially argues that these institutions are positively correlated with economic development. And what's important is that one of the key mechanisms that could explain this association is the political capacity of centralized groups in affecting policy outcomes and via this economic development. However, our main results shows that these institutions, the effects of these institutions on policy outcomes may also have unintended negative consequences for long-run development. Well, this, of course, runs in a different direction in terms of the main effects of these institutions and this literature. We believe that our results still complement to the main findings in this literature, because essentially what we argue is that centralized indigenous groups are indeed better able to implement more effective collective actions and therefore achieve the political demands. Our second contribution is in terms of this large literature analyzing the determinants of public good provision, which essentially argues that ethnic diversity is a key driver of public good provision. However, little is known about the pre-colonial institutions of ethnic groups as an important determinant of the lack of demand for the provision of large-scale public infrastructure. And last but not least, we also hope, we're hoping to contribute to this literature analyzing the impacts of large-scale infrastructure projects on economic development. In this literature, the evidence is a little bit mixed. Some studies provide evidence that these mega projects are very beneficial for economic development. Some of the studies suggest the opposite, but little is known about the role of centralized indigenous groups in affecting these mega projects. And our results essentially are very interesting because they show that in regions with more centralized indigenous groups, these mega projects tend to be less successful, which we believe these findings have very important policy implications, as I'm going to highlight later on in my presentation. Now, let's move on to the historical overview. As I explained at the beginning of my presentation, we exploit this unique experimental setting from the aftermath of the Mexican Revolution, when the first large-scale road program in Mexico emerged. Essentially, before the Mexican Revolution, there were no big roads or highways. Roads started to be built in Mexico after 1925. But importantly, this road program was used as a tool for nation building. For example, the first post-revolutionary president in Mexico, Venustiano Carranza, highlighted the necessity to begin with the social reconstruction of the nation. Waters essentially described this as a tool for forging a national identity. For example, she believed that roads meant during this period both a change in individuals' identities by broadening the process of Mexicanidad, or this idea of being only a Mexican rather than indigenous, white, or black person, and a way for individuals to come into more direct contact with the market forces and the institutions of the state. So essentially, during this period of nation building, road provision didn't discriminate among the indigenous and non-indigenous population. And our second source of variation that we want to exploit in this study is the large differences in terms of political structure and institutional complexity of the indigenous population. Now, in this figure, you can see the geospatial variation of road infrastructure in Mexico. And it's clear that by 1930s, for example, most of the Mexican territories didn't have roads. But by 1960, Mexico had a very well-developed network of roads. And it is clear that road infrastructure during this period emerged as a large-scale public infrastructure. And obviously, this program brought many benefits for communities across Mexico by allowing them, for example, to have access to different markets, but also to increase mobility, not only in terms of goods and services, but also in terms of people. However, this story was different for indigenous communities. Indigenous people saw road infrastructure not as a public good that could improve their living standards, but as a threat to their ethnic identity and local practices. For example, in the 1940s, in a municipality of the state of Chiapas in the south of Mexico, Totse people opposed the construction of a road because they believed that this road would give access to Latinos and therefore could affect their ethnic identity and local practices. And even today, as explained earlier, indigenous people still reject this large-scale public infrastructure. A clear example is Las Carreteras de las Culturas, in which indigenous people believe that this road is not going to benefit the communities, but only big businessmen. And even the president of Mexico, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, had to intervene in this case by arguing that indigenous people shouldn't be looking at the path of dispossession and repression, but instead they should be looking at the future, because these mega projects, of course, would be very beneficial for the communities. Nevertheless, indigenous people still believe that these mega projects are not going to be beneficial for their own communities. So what we did is essentially we use newly digitized and georeferenced data on public infrastructure drawn from a series of historiographical maps from these two sources, the Mexican Ministry of Transportation and the National Archives of Mexico. And after we digitized the whole length of the road network in Mexico, what we did is to follow Dalgar and co-authors and create buffers of 1 kilometer along each side of the road, as you can see in the image on the slide. And then we simply compute the share of the area of buffers within each municipality between 1920 and 1960. And of course, because the decision of using 1 kilometer is a little bit arbitrary, what we did was to create buffers of different sizes. For example, we created a large buffer of 10 kilometers, but also a much smaller buffer of 500 meters. But importantly, our results were not challenged by just changing the size of the buffers. So this would be our main dependent variable in our empirical strategy. Now, our key variable of interest was an indigenous institution index. And for that, we follow Elizalde, which is forthcoming in the Journal of Development Economics. We use these two pieces of information. First, it uses anthropological data on political complexity of the ethnic groups from this well-known ethnographic atlas for Murdoch. And specifically, it was used this variable called jurisdictional hierarchy beyond the local community. Perhaps for many of you, you're not familiar with this index, but what it is basically it classifies ethnic groups according to the respective level of political complexity before colonization. The variable ranges between 0 and 4, where lower values denote any groups with very little political complexity, and higher values essentially represent the opposite. In Mexico, we only have groups with values between 0 and 2. So for example, the Aztec has a value of 2, but we also have other major or large centralized indigenous groups, such as the Zapotecs in Oaxaca or the Tarascos in Michoacan. So the second piece of information that was used to construct this index was the ethnic composition of the indigenous population, which was taken from various censuses since the early 20th century. And specifically what we have is the share of all the ethnic groups within each municipality. And if you combine these two pieces of information, you end up with an index of indigenous institutions. And more formally, the index takes this form, which is essentially, it's a weighted population average of our anthropological variable for all the ethnic groups within each municipality in 1930. So essentially, this index will take continuous values between 0 and 2, where higher values will represent municipalities with more complex indigenous institutions. And then using this variable, we create another variable called centralization, which essentially allows to classify municipalities between centralized and fragmented. And we regard a municipality as centralized if the value of our index is higher than 0, but if the value of our index is equal to 0, we regard that municipality as fragmented. So essentially, this approach follows the same one as, for example, DPEL 2014, published in Econometrica, but also this seminal work of Genaioli and Rainel 2007. Now, in this map, you can see the variation of our index in Mexico. And it's clear that most of the variation comes from the south of Mexico, around this area. And this is not surprising because, of course, most of the centralized indigenous groups tend to be located around this region in Mexico. Now, in terms of the empirical strategy, what we did was to exploit a flexible different diff. For example, in this equation, row share is our dependent variable in municipality I at time t. And we also included a rich set of municipality fixed effects, time fixed effects, but also state by census fixed effects. And our key coefficient of interest is beta, which is the interaction between our index of indigenous institutions and the indicator for time. Essentially, this coefficient will be captured the differences in raw share between municipalities with different levels of indigenous institutions before and after the ROT program began. And of course, in this equation, we also included a rich vector of time invariant covariates, which we interacted with our indicator for time, and also a vector of time varying covariates, such as the total indigenous population, which allows to control for issues around the discrimination against the indigenous population, and also these two indices, which capture this idea of ethnic diversity within each municipality. Now, in terms of the main results of the paper, this can be seen in these two figures. Essentially, what we're plotting here is the main estimates of our flexible different diff by using our continuous values of the index and when we compare fragmented against centralized municipalities. And it's clear, for example, if you see the figure on your left, it's clear that after the ROT program began, ROT share was significantly lower in municipalities with more complex indigenous institutions. And the same is true when we compare fragmented against centralized municipalities. Now, of course, you might be thinking about the parallel trend because we're using a different diff strategy. And this is because the validity of our results relies on the assumption that in the absence of the Mexican Revolution and the nation building process, raw share would have followed parallel trends. However, we are unable to test this formally, specifically by using ROT, because as I said before, ROT didn't exist before the Mexican Revolution. ROT started to be built after 1925. However, what we did was to exploit these two rich sources of variation. Essentially, before the Mexican Revolution, there were two types of transportation in Mexico, colonial roads and railroads. Colonial roads essentially comprise a network of very rustic paths. During the colonial period, these roads were essentially used to transport natural resources such as gold and silver to the main ports of Mexico. And railroads emerged during the post-Viriato regime. Before the Mexican Revolution, railroads were used or represented the main engine of economic growth in Mexico. So to exploit these two rich sources of variation, what we did was to digitize the whole length of colonial roads in Mexico and the whole length of railroads in Mexico. And then we simply compute the share of colonial roads and the share of railroads in the same way as we did with our main dependent variable. And then we simply conducted a cross-sectional analysis in which we observe the association between our index of indigenous institutions and these two pre-revolutionary outcomes. And the main results can be seen in this table, and it's clear that our index of indigenous institutions is insignificantly correlated with pre-revolutionary public infrastructure in Mexico. Well, these results somehow confirm the main assumption of our empirical strategy. We take a further step in order to provide further evidence in terms of the parallel trends assumption. And specifically, what we did was to exploit the change in policy in public infrastructure, which occurred by mid-1950s, when the state started to prioritize modernization policy over nation building. And the idea is very simple. During the nation building period, the state not only sought to increase mobility across Mexico via roads, but also to consolidate state power. And to achieve this, the state oversaw every single stage in the construction of roads, from the design, consultation, to the construction and the maintenance of roads. So essentially, this enabled the state to use roads as a tool for forging a national sense of Mexicanidad. For example, the inauguration of new roads typically receive national coverage and also involve large-scale celebrations or events in which nationalistic messages were often transmitted to the communities. However, by mid-1950s, this policy of using roads as a tool for nation building was relaxed, and instead, the state started to offer concessions to the private sector in order to construct roads. So this essentially marked the end of this policy of using roads as a tool for nation building. So this means that after this period of nation building, road infrastructure was no longer perceived by the indigenous population as a threat to the ethnic identity and local practices. So therefore, we hypothesized that after the nation building process, road share would have followed parallel trends. So to exploit this hypothesis, what we did was to replicate our flexible lifting lift, but now we established as our new baseline period, 1960, where essentially marked the end of the nation building period, and then simply compare the evolution of roads before and after the nation building period. And in these two figures, you can see the main estimates from our flexible lifting lift. And it's clear that after the nation building process, which is marked by this vertical line here, road share follow parallel trends. And the same is true, for example, when we compare fragmented against centralized municipalities. Now, so far, the results show that indigenous people who descend from centralized societies in pre-colonial times were better able to reject a large-scale road program. Indigenous people didn't see roads as a public good that could improve their living standard, but as a public bad that could affect their ethnic identity and local practices. And let me just be clear, we're not suggesting that indigenous people are against development, as highlighted by the United Nations in this paragraph, but how these mega projects tend to be imposed within the communities. So in other words, this issue is nothing to do with the presence of these mega projects in the communities, but how indigenous people perceive the implementation of these mega projects by the state in the communities, suggesting that there is a lack of trust in the state, and this lack of trust in the state should be represented by the construction of roads. So if our hypothesis is correct, we should expect to see a lower state presence in centralized municipalities, and mainly because of two reasons. First, in centralized municipalities, indigenous people tend to have less trust in the state. And second, in centralized municipalities, indigenous people tend to have a better capacity to challenge the state presence. So in order to test this hypothesis, what we did is to collect data on state presence. Specifically, we use the number of bureaucrats within each municipality before and after the Mexican Revolution. And in this figure, you can see the evolution of the number of bureaucrats across our two groups of municipalities. And again, the dashed lines represent fragmented municipalities, and the solid lines represent centralized municipalities. And there are two important points that need to be highlighted from this graphical inspection. First, by 1900, there is somehow a bit higher number of bureaucrats in fragmented municipalities, implying that centralized indigenous groups were better able to keep the pre-revolutionary state out of the communities. However, the second point is that it's clear that after the Mexican Revolution, there is a significantly large increase in the number of bureaucrats in fragmented municipalities compared to centralized municipalities, which basically with this very simple graphical inspection, it is clear that there is a huge divergence in state presence between fragmented and centralized municipalities. Now, to formalize this association, what we did is to conduct a flexible diff and compare differences in the number of bureaucrats between municipalities with different levels of the institutions before and after the Mexican Revolution. And in this table, you can see the main estimates of this strategy. So for example, if you focus on column 4, when we compare centralized against fragmented municipalities, it's clear that after the Mexican Revolution, in central municipalities, there was a significantly lower state presence as compared to fragmented municipalities. Now, of course, we conducted another bunch of robustness checks, and I'm not going to spend too much time on this section. However, I'm very happy to go through this at the end of my presentation, but I want to highlight one important robustness check, which is basically related to whether this issue was more to do with the supply side or the demand side, because one could easily argue that the state simply didn't want to provide roads in municipalities with more indigenous population, suggesting discrimination against the indigenous population. So in order to test this idea, what we did was to simply compare the evolution of roads in municipalities with and without indigenous population. And what we observed is that the penetration of road infrastructure was the same in these two sets of municipalities. Now, let's just move on to the second part of the paper. In the second part of the paper, then we ask why is road infrastructure was lower in municipalities with centralized indigenous institutions. And for this, we propose two main mechanisms. Mechanism one is about collective action, which states that because of the legacy of pre-colonial centralized institutions, better cultural attitudes for collective actions were developed in municipalities with centralized indigenous institutions. And our mechanism two is about ethnic identity, which states that indigenous people with centralized indigenous institutions would have a higher utility for preserving their identity, and therefore would have a higher interest in rejecting roads than individuals with fragmented indigenous institutions. Now, to give evidence in terms of our mechanisms on collective actions, what we did is to exploit these other unique experimental centers, which somehow occurred after the Mexican Revolution as well. And specifically, we exploit this massive ancestral land distribution, in which in a period of about 75 years, the state redistributed 60 million hectares of ancestral land to the indigenous population. And what's interesting about this is that this distribution was not a very straightforward process. Indigenous people had to rely on a wide range of collective methods in order to make the petition successful. And what was that? Well, essentially, after the indigenous communities received approval from the state, they had to go back to the communities and claim the land to the landlords. And for obvious reasons, the landlords always rejected this distribution. So therefore, they had to rely on this set of collective methods in order to ensure that the petitions were going to be more successful at the end of the day. So in order to check whether the ancestral land distribution follow different trends in municipalities with different levels of indigenous institutions, was to use ancestral land distribution as our new dependent variable, and then replicate our flexible diff in diff. And in this figure, specifically the figure on your right, can be seen the main estimate from our flexible diff in diff when we compare fragmented against centralized municipality. But you focus on the figure on your left, when we compare simply the evolution of ancestral land distribution, it is clear that in centralized municipalities, and again represented by the solid line, it is much larger in this group of municipalities as compared to fragmented municipalities. So essentially, the results of this section suggest that indigenous people who descend from centralized societies in pre-colonial times were better able to gain more ancestral land, and also to reject a larger scale public infrastructure, which at the time represented a major threat to the ethnic identity and local practice. Now, for our second mechanism, which is about ethnic identity, what we did was to collect data, survey data on individuals' attitudes towards ethnic identity drawn from the National Survey of Discrimination Mexico, ENADIS. And ENADIS is very interesting because it collects information on the ethnicity of individuals for the indigenous population, which allows essentially to compare or to observe the extent to which centralized indigenous groups tend to preserve more their local practices and feel more proud of the ethnic identity as compared to fragmented indigenous groups. And of course, the downside of using this kind of data is that it's very recent. So ideally, we would like to have data from our main period of study from 1920s to 1950s. However, so far, this is the best data that we have in order to capture this idea of ethnic identity. So the results should be taken with a little bit caution. However, we believe that the results are very interesting. For example, we use these four questions, which allow us to observe the extent to which indigenous groups tend to feel proud with the ethnic identity. Tend to preserve more the local practices, or whether they feel more indigenous than being a Mexican, and whether they think that is right or wrong that the indigenous people decide not to relate with the non-indigenous population. And then what we did is to conduct a cross-sectional analysis. And in this table, you can see the main results using our centralization variable. And what we see is that indigenous people with centralized characteristics tend to feel prouder of the ethnic identity and tend to preserve more the costumes and local practices. And they also tend to feel more indigenous than being a Mexican. And somehow they also tend to relate less with the non-indigenous population. So overall, this result essentially suggests that if identities attitudes are transmitted over generations and people tend to receive better preferences from the ancestors, this means that centralized indigenous groups would have a lower preference to perceive road infrastructure during a period that was characterized by nation building. So therefore, they rejected this policy, especially in a period when roads were a symbol of adopting a new national ethnic identity. Now, let's move on to the last part of the paper. In the last part of the paper, then we assess the economic consequences of this rejection. And we believe that this part of the paper is quite interesting because it has a lot of policy implications behind the main results. And in order to undertake this analysis, what we did is to simply conduct a horse race between our Indigenous Institution Index and raw share by 1960. And we relied on 4 different present day economic outcomes, such as electricity by 1990, drainage, literacy rates, and satellite density by 2010. And as you can see, it is clear that raw share is positively correlated with each one of our present day economic outcomes. These results essentially suggest that in municipalities with more centralized indigenous groups, these mega projects tend to be less successful. But in the long run, what we observe in this table is that in these same areas where indigenous people were more capable of rejecting these mega projects, long-run development tend to be lower. So there is a negative correlation between the success of rejecting these mega projects with present-day outcomes. So clearly, this shows that if governments really want to see the full potential of these mega projects in the long run, they should be thinking about implementing a different approach in terms of how to implement these mega projects, especially in areas with more centralized indigenous groups. So, and then just very quickly, let me just conclude. In this paper, we find that a large-scale road infrastructure program was lower in municipalities with centralized indigenous groups as compared to fragmented municipalities. And we observed that our index of indigenous institutions was not correlated with pre-revolutionary infrastructure in Mexico. And we also observed that the trend differences in road share was only significant during the nation building period. Possible mechanism is better collective actions among centralized indigenous groups, which allow them to implement better collective actions and therefore achieve their political demands. And the other is about ethnic identity, which states that centralized groups were more likely to preserve and therefore protect the indigenous identities and traditions. And an important point is about whether this was an issue more to do with the supply side rather than the demand side. And what we observe is that this is more to do with the demand side, because we observe that the penetration of road infrastructure was the same in municipalities with or without indigenous population. Our take for this paper is quite interesting. We analyzed the association between these mega projects with indigenous population by relying on a unique experimental setting from the aftermath of the Mexican Revolution, when the first large-scale road program emerged, but was also used as a tool for nation building. Indigenous people therefore saw this policy as a threat to their identity and local practices, therefore they rejected it. But only municipalities with centralized indigenous institutions were better able to reject these mega projects, and they rejected these mega projects mainly because of the legacy of more complex political organization. And as I said before, these results have very important policy implications, because by understanding which indigenous groups are better able to reject these mega projects, this will enable government to find better negotiating strategies in which it will make these mega projects more successful and less of a threat for the indigenous community. So I think that is me. So I'm looking forward to receiving your questions. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. Aldo, thank you for your presentation. Of course, it's very interesting. While we wait for some colleagues to ask for the word, let me make some comments and some questions about it. First, I think it would be important to include a map in which showing the different types of indigenous settlements and their relation with road construction or the lack of it, because one has to imagine that the road construction does not correspond to the centralized indigenous communities, but one doesn't see that in your paper or in your presentation. And the other one is, I appreciate your very fine work with georeference databases, but I do not understand, how do you know which community at the municipal level has centralized or fragmented institutions? Because one would say that you can relate centralized institutions with more densely populated areas, but at the municipal level, how would you know that this community in particular had centralized, and this was a 0, and this was a 1, and this was a 2? How do you know that?
Well, thank you very much. Yes, sorry, Sandra.
Yeah. Sorry. So there are some big assumptions in your paper that I would like also to challenge a little bit, because you say, for instance, that because of the purposes of nation building, there was no discrimination against indigenous population between 1920 and 1950. I am not so sure that there is some relation between these two things, not necessarily. And the other assumption here is that there was a divide precisely in 1960 between a policy of nation building and one of economic modernization. I'm not so sure of that either. If there was such a divide, it took place much earlier with import substitution industrialization policies in the 1940s and not so late in the 60s. But my main concern has to do with your causality analysis. Mm-hmm. You may find a correlation between indigenous settlements and lack of railroad construction, but this does not necessarily have to do with collective action on the part of indigenous communities. There are several arguments against that implication. First, it is well known that in these years, roads were built where railroads had been built during the Porphyrian period. So there were many claims about duplication and competition between roads and railroads because they were constructed in the same routes. So there was a relation between post-revolutionary road construction policy and Porphyrian railroad construction policy, against what you say here. Second, this was so because in both cases, roads were built for reasons of economic efficiency or political convenience. So if we take a look at your map of, let's say, 1950, we would see that there were, for instance, a big road going from Mexico City to Laredo, Sonora, Nogales, Nuevo Laredo, which is the route of the National Railroad, and another road going from Mexico City to Ciudad Juárez, which is the Central Railroad, and another one going to in the West Coast. And this road in the West Coast was because Álvaro Obregón was the owner of the very important production units of cotton, sugar, and chickpeas. And there is also a road in the El Mante, famous sugar production unit by, what's his name? Plutarco Ilias Calles, right? Mm-hmm. So that's a reason also for that. And in my opinion, it would be very important to support your econometric analysis with some historical research. There are historical records in many instances that show that when indigenous communities wanted or rejected something, they would fight for it, even in the tribunals or in many other instances, as you say here somewhere with public demonstrations or with periodicals or that. So there is plenty of evidence in archives of judicial cases regarding many problems of land ownership or invasions or road infrastructure and the like. I have made a collection of papers from the Supreme Court regarding land reform in the 1920s, not precisely your topic, but there one can see that indigenous populations are fighting for what they want, are rejecting publicly what they don't want. So some historical research might substantiate better your research. And finally, the idea that land redistribution confirms your hypothesis is also subject to debate, in my opinion. The reasoning here would be that indigenous communities requested and received land, and were centralized communities, but did not want roads, and so they were not built. However, one of the main claims against agrarian reform as it was undertaken in this period was that indigenous people got lands but did not get credit, although they were in bad need for credit. So your reasoning could lead us to say that they did not get credit because they rejected financial modernization or something like that. So that's what I would say. we have other, do you want to answer, or do you want to hear more comments or questions?
Yeah, I could start with this. Otherwise, I'm gonna get too confused with all the questions maybe the audience will say. So I think regarding your first point about how to know which indigenous group is centralized and which is not, well, basically this is essentially is by constructing our index of indigenous institutions, we know the identity of the ethnic group. So by just combining that information with our anthropological data, then we just basically match based on the ethnic identity and then assign a value of our index of political complexity. Okay. That's and we are able to do that because we have data at the municipality level. So we have the data in terms of the ethnic composition of the indigenous groups, and therefore we are able to know what is the level of political complexity of each of the ethnic groups in Mexico within each municipality. Okay. The second point is about the nation building, whether this was not, I think the argument here is, yeah, I agree that there must be some issues whether they were discriminated or not during the nation building period. However, the main argument is clear that what we have read in terms of the historical sources is that this period between 1920s to 1950s was mainly a period of state consolidation. After the Mexican Revolution, of course, it was like a lot of political unrest, and therefore the state, all what it wanted is to ensure that it wanted to show that there was some sort of political integration across Mexico. Okay, and they relied on this program quite extensively to go to each one of the very remote areas in Mexico and then ensure that the state presence was going to be there. Okay, of course, the road programs, as you see, it started from Mexico City, and it just basically went mainly to the south, of course, because there was perhaps more interest in terms of the trade that Mexico had with the United States at the time, but also, as you can see, by 1950s, Mexico had some sort of a very well network of roads. Okay, and the argument is that if you provide a public good that is meant to be used as a tool for nation building, the main assumption that you put forward is that there shouldn't be discriminate between indigenous and non-indigenous. And one of the key arguments that we test that idea is when we compare the evolution of roads in municipalities with or without indigenous population. And it's very clear that that evolution, that penetration was exactly the same. For example, that is the figure when we show the evolution of road share in municipalities with or without indigenous institutions. There is no differences between them, especially during the period of nation building process. Okay, so in terms of the casualty, which I think, let me just see if I remember, in terms of right, I think we will have to have a think about the other two. So maybe we can just take more questions from the audience. Thanks.
Excuse me, I didn't hear that.
Okay.
I didn't hear you. What did you say?
Sorry. I might need to just have a think about this other two.
Okay. Okay. Good.
Yeah.
So do you want to take more questions?
Yes, of course.
Yeah. Thank you very much for your replies, Aldo. Pablo Martin wanted to say something. Pablo Martinelli. Are you there, Pablo? Hello?
Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So thank you, Aldo. Very nice paper. I was thinking about I like it very much, and I was thinking about the mechanism and this story of collective action driven by pre-colonial institutions, right? And I'm not really convinced about this, because this will survive. That this will mean that you have some form of political organization surviving after 400 years of colonial rule, right? I don't know if this is very convincing. So what came to my mind when I was looking at your results, and also having a look at how the index is constructed, is that maybe here there is something which is ethnic group specific. Let me be more clear. Political complexity in prehistoric times, say, or in pre-modern times, is a function of population density, right? So very small groups are economically and politically simple, whereas it's a necessity to have some degree of state formation for holding together a large, dense population. And therefore, I was thinking whether there is some, but you are measuring this at the municipality level, which is, I think, a bit, but yeah, this, and maybe there is some extra municipality spillover, because indigenous ethnic groups which were more complex were also larger, and therefore it's likely, it's more likely for places having these ethnic groups having access to other ethnic or other populations in other municipalities with the same ethnic group. So if you have basically, if you are the state and if you want to build a road through a municipality when there is an indigenous group who was only a band, this means that they have no connections with other ethnic groups, right? So you send the police there and you crash them and you build the road. Whereas if you have a similar, another municipality with a much larger ethnic group, you don't want to mess with them very much, because this may result into a regional revolt or something, because they have there is spillovers between this locality and they have, I don't know, lower information costs with other neighboring municipalities. They have religious connections, or something which is not necessarily a politically ingrained mechanism, but something which allows them to allows these particular larger ethnic groups to have a more resonating across the region political voice. So I don't know if this is maybe you can test this by simply making a diff in diff with different numbers of share of specific ethnic groups. I don't know how many indigenous groups do you have in the sample, and I don't know if this is feasible or not, but maybe it's simply that you have a lot of Mayas in the south or something like this, and you don't want to mess with this ethnic group because it's simply larger, and there are a lot of municipalities where you have many of these larger ethnic groups than other, and this happens to have been more complex also. But okay, so this was my main concern, but very nice nonetheless paper. So this was all.
Would you like to answer, or do you want another couple of questions? No.
No. I would like to. I would like to answer very quickly. So regarding the first point, I think I would disagree with that point that there is no persistent in terms of indigenous institutions. It is clear that during the colonial period, indigenous people were not wiped out. As a matter of fact, they were allowed to use the local practices and their own system in order to provide the main collective interests. For example, they will have to pay tribute to the crown, and that was some sort of system that persisted for most of the colonial period. So, and this is the idea of the so-called República de Indios and the República of the Spanish. The República de Indios essentially represented the indigenous population. And by the time of, for example, the independence, there was a huge number of indigenous population. And of course, there is also this issue of indigenous people were disseminated by diseases. But again, always indigenous people preserve the kind of the numbers across the Americas. So essentially, they always were the majority as compared to, for example, the white people or the Spanish. So I think that by just thinking that they were allowed to carry on with their own local forms of organizations and living in their own communities for centuries, I believe that created some sort of persistency in the long term. In terms of whether this is more to do with the population sizes of indigenous groups, we tackle that issue. We agree that there must be some sort of a correlation between population density, and perhaps this must be capturing something or picking up the effect of what we are meant to provide in this study. And what we did was to simply control for the share of indigenous population, which essentially captures this idea in terms of population density, and not only for the whole population, but specifically for the indigenous population. So if the mechanism runs from population sizes for the indigenous population, essentially our index shouldn't be very important in our estimation. And what we observe is that it doesn't affect the main effect of our indigenous institution index. And I think this is related also to your last point, Pablo. So I think the other point was about the spillover effect. Maybe I'm thinking about perhaps doing some sort of a spatial analysis in which we're still trying to think how to move forward regarding this point. But yeah, I think great points, great questions and great points. Thank you very much, Pablo.
Well, thank you very much, Aldo. Alfonso had a question.
Yeah, thank you. Aldo, can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you for the paper. I really liked it. Well, I already knew it. I was wondering, so you stress the role of identity in the story, and this would explain resistance. I was wondering if there might be different, alternative explanations for resistance to this potential threat on identity. I'm thinking mainly about potential threats on the local economy by the integration in the national market. And maybe one way to check this, but I guess this is another paper, might be to do a similar analysis with other public services. I'm thinking about the schools. I don't know if the period would allow it, but schools clearly go against the local identity, but they don't have this effect on the local economy. So this might be something interesting to check. I don't know what's your reaction about this. And regarding this potential threat on the local economy, I was thinking if this is true, this might involve a different attitude towards short distance routes compared with long distance roads. So you can resist long distance roads, but not a better transport system in your neighborhood. I don't know if this is clear. These are just, general thoughts. I'm not expecting like very specific answers, but I don't know if you have any reaction.
Yeah. Thanks, Alfonso. Really great points. I think regarding your first comment, I think this is very interesting because we thought about that. We thought about maybe we can use about the number of, for example, schools that were constructed within each municipality as a way to capture this idea of ethnic identity. However, we haven't found this data. However, we are now in the process of using another set of results in which we would like to use, for example, common names during our main period of analysis from 1920s to 1950s. We have the data, but it's a little bit mess at the moment. So I think that could also tackle this issue about ethnic identity, okay? Because it's data from our main period of analysis. And again, I think we could test this idea of ethnic identity using all the public goods by using school. However, the issue is, again, the data is not really good. And I think your second point, I think it's a great point. I haven't thought about that. So I think we just have to explore about this approach. Thank you very much, Alfonso.
Thank you, Aldo. Albert Foch? Hello, Albert. Are you there? Okay.
Hola, buenas tardes.
Okay. Please.
Aldo, bueno, felicitarte por la presentación porque ha sido realmente interesante. Tenía 3 preguntas para ti. Una de ellas quizás incide en lo que te comentaba Pablo, porque a mí se me hace difícil imaginarme unas instituciones indígenas inmutables a lo largo de un periodo tan largo, cuando en algunos de estos periodos hay una efervescencia de los movimientos indígenas que en buena medida redefinen todo el indigenismo y probablemente las instituciones también. La segunda cuestión que te quería comentar es, no sé si has tenido oportunidad en alguna ocasión de leer autores como Toledo, Narciso Barrera Bassols, Carboe, que vinculan claramente diversidad biológica con diversidad cultural. Y en ese sentido, sí, esto podría ser, o sea, la complejidad de la diversidad cultural en un lugar podría ser también un mecanismo que ayudara, que contribuyera al rechazo a estos megaproyectos. Y por último, es más bien una curiosidad, es si entre los casos que habéis estudiado de rechazo a los megaproyectos, se encuentra uno que es bastante relevante en Chiapas, en el estado de Chiapas, que es la proyectada autovía de San Cristóbal de las Casas a Palenque, que está proyectada, si no estoy errado, desde finales del siglo XX, y a día de hoy no me consta que se haya construido ni un solo kilómetro. Eran estas 3 cuestiones.
Ok, bien. Sí, ¿puedo contestar esto? ¿No?
Sí, por supuesto.
Ok, gracias, Sandra. Gracias, Albert. Bueno, sobre el punto sobre si hay una persistencia en estas instituciones indígenas, yo creo que el punto clave de esto es de que cuando se mide las instituciones indígenas estamos utilizando un índice que tiende a ser muy constante por el tiempo. Una vez que las instituciones indígenas alcanzan un nivel alto, ya no, por ejemplo, ya no cambia tanto. Por ejemplo, los aztecas tenían un valor ya como representaban instituciones bien centralizadas, ¿okay? Al tiempo de la colonia hay una integración con otro tipo de instituciones, pero ya no pudo crecer, ya no tendría que crecer esas instituciones. Se mantienen sobre el tiempo, o sea, son muy constantes, no varía tanto una institución, o sea, una institución que ya es centralizada no puede bajar, por ejemplo, a ser como un grupo o una institución fragmentada, o sea, como los grupos que tienden a ser más remotos, por ejemplo, los grupos en el Amazonas, ¿ok? Entonces, y también está la cuestión histórica. Aquí hay que tomar muy bien en cuenta esta parte. O sea, como le comenté a Pablo, el hecho de que mantuvieron sus instituciones durante la colonia y les permitieron usar sus modos de organización y de sistemas para poder, proveer sus bienes colectivos a la corona y también organizarse internamente. Eso permitió que esta organización que existía en la época precolonial persistiera durante la colonia y hasta el día de hoy. Entonces, es una parte tanto histórica que se tiene que tomar en cuenta, pero también de medidas de cómo medirlas. yo estoy de acuerdo que a lo mejor esta medida antropológica no es muy exacta. Hay unos errores ahí, pero hemos hecho ciertas adecuaciones al índice. Por ejemplo, en mi paper que se acaba de publicar en el Journal of Development Economics, hay una serie de test de robustness checks en este índice. Por ejemplo, lo transformo, ubico, por ejemplo, en las regiones donde hay algo como un tipo árbol lingüístico en el cual capturo este efecto de instituciones indígenas mediante la lengua lingüística de los grupos. Y de esa manera trato de abordar un poquito más la cuestión de los errores en este índice antropológico. Si tienes ahí algún tiempo, échale una mirada al paper que tengo ahí para que puedas ver los diferentes procesos o los diferentes robustness checks que implementé para poder hacer el testeado en esta construcción de este índice. El segundo punto, yo creo que está interesante. O sea, yo no sabía, no tengo conocimiento del trabajo de estos autores, pero me parece que podría funcionar. O sea, esta cuestión de diferencias de video culturales, yo creo que podría jalar. Necesitaría verlo y ver cómo esta complejidad también podríamos testearla. Y del punto del caso en Chiapas, estaría genial poderlo usar como un caso de estudio, como un caso particular, como a modo de mencionarlo. Y yo no tenía conocimiento de este caso en específico, pero seguramente hay varios. ¿Ok? O sea, varios. O sea, por ejemplo, yo cuando estuve en México, en Morelos, perdón, había también un puente y le pregunté al taxista, oye, ¿por qué no han construido ese puente? No, pues es que no los dejan. ¿Cómo les dicen? les dicen los que no hablan español, los definieron de una manera muy extraña a la comunidad donde estaba ese puente. Entonces, prácticamente no han dejado construir un puente que podría conectar dos comunidades. Entonces, hay muchos casos, ¿ok? Que podríamos, por ejemplo, de una manera ponerlo en el apéndice o hablar sobre casos específicos sobre este caso. Gracias, Albert.
Well, thank you very much. We don't have more questions, I think. So thank you, Aldo, very much for your very interesting presentation and research work. And thank also Eduardo Hidalgo and Nayeli Salgado, the co-authors of this paper. And before ending our session, I would like to mention what is going to happen in our next session. On October the 30th, we will have Manuel Yorca Jaña presenting Interpersonal Violence in Chile, 1880s to 2010s, a tale of delayed but successful convergence. So we invite you to participate in this next session as well. And thank you very much, all of you, for participating. Have a nice weekend. Bye-bye. Bye.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Sandra.
You're very welcome, Aldo.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.